Dear friends and colleagues, good afternoon. I'm Greg Scarlatoiu, Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. based Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Hopefully, this is a good time for friends and supporters of HRNK and our cause on the East Coast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast, as well as in Korea, Japan, and Europe. We have very diverse representation today geographically. We're very happy to see that so many friends of our organization have joined. Let me begin by acknowledging the HRNK board members who are in attendance today. John Dupre, co-vice chair of the board, has joined us. So has Dr. Marcus Noland of the Peterson Institute, and so has Tom Barker of Foley Hoeg. Let me also greet General Chip Gregson, who has joined us today, and also my good friend, Dr. Nimal Gunatileke, joining us from Michigan. We are featuring an exquisite program today. We have an extraordinary guest, the Honorable Morse Tan, who has served until recently as U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. The topic Ambassador Tan is going to address today is North Korea, atrocity crimes and future accountability. Prior to serving as ambassador, Ambassador Tan was a professor at Northern Illinois University. He is one of the world's most prolific authors on legal issues pertaining to North Korean human rights, transitional justice, accountability. He's well known for being the author of the book North Korea, International Law and the Dual Crises, Narrative and Constructive Engagement. I was talking to Ambassador Tan prior to the program, and we both remembered how Michael Kirby, who has also spoken to HRNK on Zoom, the former chief commissioner of the UN Commission of Inquiry, was showing everyone Ambassador Tan's book at a gathering here in Washington, D.C., over its size, recommending that everyone read his book. That was an extraordinary endorsement. Ambassador Tan has been, his work has been very well received by the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, speaking of Michael Kirby, of course, by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and also by senior South Korean and U.S. diplomats, including the South Korean ambassador to the United States and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State who led negotiations with North Korea. Ambassador Tan's bio is also available in the chat function as part of this conversation. Without further ado, Ambassador Tan, it's an extraordinary honor and a privilege to be hosting you today, sir. I am going to turn it over to you. Please proceed.
Thank you so much for having me, Greg, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be hosted by you and by HRNK in this virtual event. It's also good to hear about the people who are joining us. A number of you, I think I have cited in my scholarship in the past and have admired the work of many of you as we all seek to address the dual crises relating to North Korea. It is well known in the US, but also outside the US, the security crisis in regards to North Korea. You have the intercontinental ballistic missile technology that has been demonstrated to be able to shoot over the continental United States, not to mention major stockpiles of biological weapons, of chemical weapons, as well as a huge supply of conventional weapons as well, and not to mention the fact that you have the four largest militaries arrayed around the peninsula, where you have the US, Russia, China, and North Korea. South Korea's military is also strong and has various asymmetrical strength vis-a-vis North Korea as well. And I do think that the Security crisis is better known than the other major crisis, namely the human rights crisis in regards to North Korea. And that is the one that I will focus on more. I've written about both. And I do think both the human rights and the security crises should be addressed together, that it should not be a situation, as has too often been the case, where the human rights aspects of things has been cordoned off as the security crisis is addressed. I actually think addressing both can reinforce the efforts and can help to solve either or both of the crises, as opposed to leaving the human rights crises off to the side. Let me briefly sketch a few aspects of the human rights crisis that is in North Korea. I coined a term to describe what is going on in North Korea because it is so dire, it is hard to encapsulate in a single term. But the term that I put forward is rightlessness, that the people of North Korea, all of their rights are dishonored and trampled upon by the totalitarian regime in North Korea. They live in a state of rightlessness. The North Korean state is one that, because it does not honor the rights of its people, is in a state of rightlessness. And what does this look like? It looks like, in two words, a criminal cult, where you have the worship, the deification of three Kims who have ruled North Korea, and you have all manner of crimes being committed within and without North Korea. The most emblematic part of these of the gross systematic violations of human rights occur in the concentration camps in North Korea, which have yet to be shut down. These are like the camps, as I have stated before, akin to those of Hitler, Mao, and Stalin. There is no hyperbole or exaggeration in that statement in terms of the depth of criminal activity against those who are in these concentration camps, the ruthless torture that takes place, and the many people who do not survive being in the camps. Most do not survive being in there. This is a regime that has murdered some 15 million of its own people. A huge number, given that we're talking about a country of only 24 million here. And indeed, the whole country is one jail of a country. People are not freely allowed to move within the country, much less without the country. One cannot cross the street in Pyongyang without permission. There is no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of assembly. It is organized around perceived loyalty to the Kim regime, and people are put in this sort of caste system of 53 levels based on perceived political loyalty, where everything from education, food, shelter, clothing, job opportunities are all defined and determined by where one stands in this caste system based on perceived political loyalty inside of North Korea. So the dual crises of security and human rights are very serious. And from here, I want to focus on first a few comments on things that can be done to help the situation, but then more particularly on the accountability piece and justice piece. First, I want to talk about a few things that can be done to address what is going on in North Korea. The people are starved for true and accurate information. And so all the efforts that are made to counter the pervasive propaganda in North Korea, whether it's through zip drives, whether it's through cell phones, whether it's through smart balloons that carry valuable information, whether it's radio broadcasts, all the different ways for accurate information to get into North Korea is very critical. And I think it would behoove all governments involved to not be against such efforts, but to support such efforts, to not block such efforts, but to actually encourage and foster such efforts, because the people of North Korea need to receive the information that is there. And to just give a couple of sorts of examples, very from maybe most people's perspective outside of North Korea, very sort of mundane sorts of examples. But you have North Korean defectors who have said they have left North Korea because they watched South Korean soap operas and they see life portrayed in South Korea, and they cannot believe the contrast to the deprivation and oppression that prevails in North Korea, and they long for a different life. And so South Korean soap operas have had their impact. The movie Titanic has had an impact as well. Something that, again, might just be taken for granted in a lot of places that people could watch that, but this is contraband inside of North Korea. And one of the things that impacted people in North Korea about Titanic is the whole idea that one person would risk and sacrifice his life for another. That has had a major impact in North Korea as well. And various other pieces of literature, broadcasts, there's a whole array of things that are having a major impact. I remember one refugee, and certainly not the only refugee who has said this, but many refugees have talked about how it is common for those in North Korea, notwithstanding the restrictions, to access these sorts of things. So it's very important for information to get into North Korea. Another thing that I want to say is that governments should be encouraging groups that are looking out for the human rights of the people in North Korea, that there should not be any blocking or discouraging or prevention of the good work that these organizations are doing. HRNK is one. There's various ones in South Korea as well. I have a whole list of them in Appendix 2 of my book, where I list many organizations who are doing excellent work in regards to North Korea and the human rights situation in particular. This should be encouraged. This should be fostered. This should be allowed to move ahead rather than being perceived and spoken of as a security threat. Actually, it is the regime in North Korea that poses the security threat. It is not these groups who are speaking for the rights of people in North Korea that are the security threat. And appeasing the regime and just trying to go along with what the Kim regime is putting forward as necessary is not the answer. This sort of weak appeasement is despised by the Kim regime, and it is something that they will continue to take advantage of if that is the approach that is taken. Those who are refugees should not be sent back to North Korea. And whether it is the Chinese government that does so, or whether it is sadly the South Korean government that has also done so, this should never happen, because it is fundamentally the wrong thing to do, especially when people who are sent there are sent to be tortured, sent to concentration camps, many times executed. This violates the Refugee Convention, which China, by the way, has ratified. And at a minimum, even if you adopt or accept for the sake of argument, China saying that these are economic migrants, sending them back is a violation because they become refugee surplus, which means even if they weren't refugees prior to departing North Korea and going into China, which is where they most commonly go, if they are going to suffer the sort of crimes against them inside of North Korea that they commonly do, it makes them refugee surplus, which means they should not be sent back to North Korea to be tortured, to be executed, to be sent to concentration camps. This, too, is a very serious issue, and North Korean refugees should be welcomed and protected, not sent to suffer unspeakable crimes back inside of North Korea. With these things said, I want to turn now to the heart of what I want to propose in regards to North Korea and the massive justice deficit that exists inside of North Korea. There is a great need for accountability and justice inside of North Korea for the horrendous human rights violations and mass atrocity crimes that have been committed there. And I propose a three-tier approach with respect to what is going on there. Number one, I propose that a hybrid tribunal be formed to be able to try those who are most responsible for the most egregious crimes committed by the regime in North Korea. And that is starting from Kim Jong-un and those who are at the top of that regime. And Kim Jong-un especially, because it is a totalitarian dictatorship that is so thoroughgoing in what it does. It makes 1984 look like a picnic by comparison. A hybrid tribunal is part international, part domestic, and there are a lot of specifics that could be tailored to specifically to what is going on in North Korea and what the situation is. And ideally, it brings the best of international and domestic prosecutions to bear in the way in which it's tailored. I've written about this in the book that Greg mentioned, as well as in a law review article. I will not go in depth into it at this point, but I will put that as tier one in terms of those who are most responsible for the most heinous crimes that have been committed in North Korea. Secondly, domestic prosecution, especially for mid-level, those who have committed crimes at the mid-level. This could actually be done immediately in South Korea because, according to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea, all Koreans, whether in north of the 38th parallel or below, are Korean citizens. And as such, there is jurisdiction that South Korean courts have over North Korean nationals. There could be initially in absentia trials. There's ample evidence that exists. There's a UN entity that has been collecting evidence. The North Korea database organization has also been trying to collect ample evidence as well. And there is a great deal of evidence, and these legal actions domestically could start immediately inside of South Korean courts. And this is something that can be done and should be done to bring a measure of justice for the people of North Korea who are suffering so horrendously because of these atrocious crimes that are committed against them. Finally, the lowest level would be those who are least responsible could be brought before a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission or something akin to that. It has happened in various parts of the world and come under various different names. But this has been a vehicle that has been used to try to bring out the truth of what has happened, try to bring reconciliation with victims, tries to bring healing to the situation and to the country. And again, the specifics of it, as it's had various variations across the world, could be tailored to the particular specifics inside of North Korea. But this would be the tier that would address those who are least responsible in terms of the authority structure within North Korea. This prospect of accountability is something that reportedly the leadership in North Korea fear greatly, almost above anything else. And as such, this is something that should be placed within any negotiation that takes place, in any approach that takes place with respect to North Korea. There can be a great deal of leverage that can be brought to bear based on the threat from their perspective of prosecution and of justice. Justice initiatives shouldn't be considered threats. In fact, there should be no need for them if the government is justly and fairly treating its own people. However, that is not the case, and grossly and systematically you have these mass atrocity crimes that are taking place in North Korea. And so because of that, there is this avenue that can provide negotiation leverage, but more fundamentally, it is the right thing to do because the people of North Korea have been trampled upon so badly and so horrendously. This can also be in the context of moving towards reunification. If the Koreas are reunified, it would potentially solve a lot of issues and a lot of problems. Ideally, this reunification would happen peacefully, and it would reverse the division of the Koreas that happened as Korea moved from its liberation at the end of World War II, only to be cut in half by Joseph Stalin negotiating for half of Korea, namely North Korea, and sadly, the US at that time acquiescing to that request by Stalin. But Stalin never negotiated for half of Korea in order to be content with half. The Korean War was launched when he gave the green light to try to reunify the Koreas by force. And it has been the objective of North Korea to reunify by force, the consistent objective of North Korea to reunify by force after fomenting positive political and social sentiment in South Korea, and also getting the US to not be committed to defend South Korea, which has been the greatest deterrent against North Korean aggression. When North Korea invaded in the Korean War, that was the first time that the nascent UN Security Council had condemned aggressive war on the part of one country to another. And this happened unanimously. The Soviet Union did not attend the Security Council meetings thinking that it was exercising a veto by boycotting these meetings, but the Security Council at the time did not consider this to be a veto via boycott. It just counted the Soviet Union absent from these meetings, and thus you had this united UN Security Council, who really actually was the umbrella organization under which the coalition of 20-some countries defended South Korea against North Korean aggression. I dream someday that there would be this peaceful reunification of the Koreas. I dream someday that there will be a measure of freedom and peace and justice, and that the two Koreas would once again be fully united and thriving. I think it is the wrong thing for South Korea to move in the direction of North Korea's systems, but rather it should be North Korea that should move in the direction of South Korea's systems, which have been far more successful, and the fruit of which has been born over these past 7.5 decades has been much better fruit, and the contrast has been remarkable. So it would only make sense for a united Korea to be united under systems that have given to South Korea a measure of freedom and prosperity and justice and a certain respect for human rights. And I would only wish that a united Korea would move further and further in that direction rather than the other way around. With that said, I know that there may be questions. I believe Greg will be moderating these. There's, of course, much more that I could say, but I would rather entertain your questions and be able to more specifically address what it is any of you would want to ask me. Thank you so much.
Ambassador Tan, thank you very much for sharing your vision with us, your vision that regards Korean reunification under a free, prosperous, democratic Korea, Republic of Korea, as the ultimate answer to all of these issues we are dealing with, the North Korean conundrum. Also, thank you for sharing your vision on future transitional justice in North Korea involving hybrid tribunals, domestic prosecution, and truth and reconciliation commissions. Before we proceed with the Q&A, let me also say that Suzanne Schulte, co-vice chair of the board and president of the North Korea Freedom Coalition, has also joined us, and so has David Hawk, HRNK author of the well-known Hidden Gulag Reports and Parallel Gulag Reports. That said, I would like to tell the distinguished participants that there are really three ways of asking questions. One is through the chat function. The other one is through the Q&A that you're already using, I see. The other one by means of raising your hand. It's a big group. I would highly recommend the Q&A or the chat function. But my colleague, Timothy Cho, has had his hand raised from the very beginning. So we're going to turn it over to him for the first question. My colleague Rosa Park, HRNK Director of Programs, has worked very hard to make this program happen, continues to navigate and take the program in the right direction technologically and in many other ways. So I think that Timothy, you're ready to ask that question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Greg. And I think, well, I would like to raise 10 questions, but obviously there are many people having questions for you. Thank you, Mr. Tan, that your excellent and knowledge and understanding of North Korean situation. And I can first say to you that I am actually a North Korean defector living in the UK, and it's been around 10 years that I've been living in the UK. I actually have two questions I will make quite shortly. First one is about accountability, and whether that is a high level, medium, or a list of the accountability. How much percentage of accountability do you think the international community can actually practically bring back the North Korean regime to the International Criminal Court? In the meantime, we cannot force the domestic law to obey by bringing them into the International Criminal Court. And the second question is about, you referred peaceful Korean unification someday, which I completely agree with you. And I also dream of this peaceful Korean unification one day to come, as my grandfather was born in South Korea as well. And by forcibly, somehow he ended up in North Korea, which he passed away in North Korea. And he asked me to visit his hometown in South Korea, which I did a few years ago. And we believe this is going to happen someday. But by all means, if I would like to point this significant thing is it has to be, the change has to come first from North Korean side. The democratic transition has to come. By all means, that is going to reduce what it means the most dangerous situation we might going to avoid on the Korean Peninsula. If there is another world situation, could be possibly arise otherwise. And yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you.
Yes. So the International Criminal Court did actually open an investigation in regards to the DPRK, as it's called. Sadly, the only thing that is true in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is Korea. But when the ICC opened an investigation, there were only two incidents that it investigated, namely the sinking of the Cheonan, the naval corvette, the South Korean naval corvette that was sunk, and the shelling of Yeongpyeong Island. And the reason for that is North Korea is not a member state of the Rome Statute, which formed the International Criminal Court. And since it's not a member state, the only path for jurisdiction that existed was via incidents that would happen on the territory of a member state, namely South Korea, the Republic of Korea. And these were two instances where things happened inside of South Korea. Those investigations did not proceed very far, to be frank. I wish they had gone farther. The ICC did open up the possibility of further investigations with respect to the DPRK, but that is all that was done. Although there was still the door left open for the possibility of future investigations. Obviously, there's been some challenges in regards to the U.S. and Israel vis-a-vis the ICC, even though the U.S. in the past had, in certain instances, supported the ICC in some of its endeavors in terms of a couple of defendants turning themselves in at a U.S. embassy in the past. But those will be the things that I will mention in regards to the ICC. I'll also mention that there was a president of the ICC who was South Korean, who is South Korean, former president now. So I will mention that as well. In regards to reunification, if North Korea is desirous of peacefully reuniting, all the better. That would be fantastic. If there were initial reforms on the path towards reunification inside of North Korea, that too would be welcome. There has not been a substantial step in that direction as of yet by North Korea. And given that it's a regime that operates on the basis of force, it seems that they will not voluntarily go that path, and that efforts to engage with this regime must be robust, must be strong. I believe there's probably no other way that we'll have a chance of resolving the dual human rights and security crises relating to North Korea other than very strong approaches. Not reckless ones, but robust and strong, and that are full-orbed in both addressing human rights as well as security issues. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Tan. A quick clarification. This is Timothy Cho affiliated working with Lord Alton in the UK. I mistakenly stated that it was our Timothy, who's a bright young scholar. Nevertheless, Timothy Cho is a great friend of HRNK. We work very closely together. The next question goes to Professor Sandra Fahey, who is asking a question about evidence. The DPRK always claims that there is no evidence. What will be identified as evidence in the three types of accountability structures that you put forth, Ambassador Tan?
Yes, the claim that there is no evidence is just patently false. It is propaganda. If you take, for example, the testimony, eyewitness testimony that exists, which is normally admissible in courts of law, that alone is there is a mountain of such eyewitness testimony that exists that doesn't even start to get into secondary sources, but even in terms of direct eyewitness testimony, which is normally admissible in courts of law, that alone is a huge mass that exists. Sadly, there are orders that are given that if there was ever an attempt to liberate the concentration camps, that there are standing orders to kill and murder all the people who are in there and to try to hide all evidence of the concentration camps existing. And this is on top of the people inside of there being treated as if they were not even human, inhumanely, in every sort of way. And so there is an attempt to hide. Oftentimes these concentration camps are between mountains, but you know, there is satellite imagery. North Korea says, oh, these are farming villages, right? And they try to have some sort of propaganda lie to mask, as is commonly the case. When there are mass atrocity crimes committed, usually there's a convoy of lies, convoy of propaganda that tries to mask and hide and keep people from being aware. The UN entity inside of South Korea has been gathering evidence, but the eyewitness testimonial evidence alone is a mountain that exists, that cuts through the propaganda and the lies, denying these crimes have taken place. More nuance and specificity can be given, but that I think is maybe the most important point.
Ambassador Tan, thank you. The next question comes from Jasmine Shin. Ambassador Tan, you have been addressing accountability, future accountability. What can be done now? What can the international community do now to prevent and stop abuses that are currently ongoing in North Korea? Thank you.
I think there should be bold declaration of what is happening, and there should be corresponding actions that express disapproval. This can be done in the form of sanctions of various kinds. This could be done in the form of public statements and denunciations. This can be brought into the negotiation processes. In the Singapore summit, human rights was the second most talked about subject, according to the US President Trump, who was negotiating at that time. And the ways that it was brought to bear, whether it was the State of the Union address or other ways where Chi Sung-ho, now a representative in South Korea, was featured prominently in there. There are various ways in which this could be made known publicly, but also to bring information, into North Korea. There is a dearth of accurate information inside of North Korea. And so the more they could be made aware that they're not living in the greatest place on planet Earth, according to the propaganda, that paradise is not just around the corner under the Kim Jong-un regime. These are all lies that are spoken regularly to the people of North Korea. And so the more true information can be brought in. And I saw a written question asking if leaflets from South Korea should be allowed to be sent to North Korea. I think the answer is resoundingly yes, as far as I'm concerned. It is a grave mistake, in my view, to restrict or to make illegal such sending of information from South Korea to North Korea. So those are a few thoughts.
And we did have a question from Kenneth Wasserman along those lines, asking
Yes.
about a particular issue of the leaflet drop into.
I saw that.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to my colleague, June Kim next, HRNK. Ambassador Tan, what should the U.S. role be in the reunification of the two Koreas?
Yes. I think the U.S. is in a unique position in many ways. One, in terms of the U.S. role in leading the UN coalition that made it so that South Korea could even exist rather than being overrun by the North at that time. And I think the U.S., there's a lot more unanimity and consensus, whether it's on the Hill or whether it's across political parties, that there should be action and public diplomacy that takes place in regards to both the security and the human rights situation. When in Congress there are votes relating to North Korea, it's almost always almost unanimous, whether Democrats or Republicans alike. That's not true in South Korea. The North Korea issue has been deeply politicized in South Korea, which means the US is able to speak, I think, with a greater, stronger, more unified voice in terms of the truth and reality of what is going on in North Korea than South Korea is able to do, given how divided and how politicized the North Korea issue is. The US also has more power of every kind to bring to bear. And the full panoply of tools that the US has should be brought to bear to try to bring about a resolution to both the human rights and the security crises of North Korea, whether it's diplomatic ones, legal ones that I was talking about, political ones, whether it's sanctions, whether secondary sanctions, whether it's the different negotiations that can take place with key allies, but also reaching out to the North, whether it's peaceful cultural exchanges by various countries with North Korea, whether it's sending in and encouraging the information, whether it's supporting organizations that are doing excellent work in regards to North Korea, whether it is robustly putting forward as much pressure as can be brought to bear to help to turn North Korea in a better direction and to resolve these dual crises. To me, it's not either or in terms of all these different tools either. I think it's all the above is my view. And the more all of these things can be wisely in a carefully thought out sequence and approach to bring all these tools potentially to bear in regards to North Korea, the better. I think the U.S. can play a very key role. The U.S. can also play a key role in regards to China, who has a lot of means to be able to impact North Korea as well. And there was a period of time where China was actually moving forward with the UN Security Council sanctions, for example. That happened for a time. They're breaking it now. Secondary sanctions, I think, are in order for those who are breaking the UN Security Council sanctions that have been put forth. And the EU can continue to be involved. There's all sorts of countries that could be involved. Britain has played an important role and can continue to play an important role in all this. So in my view, all the different actors in all the different ways, as much as possible, as wisely as possible, as soon as possible. As far as I'm concerned, all these things would be called for, from my perspective. I can't go into specifics in terms of every single aspect of this, but that's my answer at this point in this limited forum.
Thank you, Ambassador Tan. A question from Sam Barron. What steps can the US government take to allow North Korean defectors and refugees to resettle in the United States? Should they be granted the same refugee status as Uyghurs, for example? How does the North Korean Human Rights Act apply? An act we've had since 2004, reauthorized on multiple occasions.
That's right. And the North Korean Human Rights Act, as you're correctly alluding to, does specifically allow for North Korean refugees to come to the US. As of yet, the numbers to the US have been admittedly very small. It may be hovering somewhere in the ballpark. Some may have a more updated figure than I do, but I would guesstimate at this point maybe somewhere in the 400-ish range at this point, which is awfully low. The North Korean Human Rights Act in the US was initially passed, if my memory serves me right, in 2004, I want to say. And that's a very small number over the span of time from 2004 to the present. And so there is a need to vet, because there are North Korean spies in North America as well, in the US as well. And so there is a need to vet, but those who are truly refugees, those who are genuinely seeking asylum in the US, from my view, should be welcomed in larger numbers with open arms, is my view on it. Great Britain has done a marvelous job of welcoming refugees from North Korea, and I commend Great Britain for what it's done along these lines. I think South Korea should continue to have programs for helping North Korean refugees with housing, with education, with basic needs, with job training, and should continue to try to be hospitable and generous to the 30,000 plus refugees who are there. More can be done there, but there are approximately over 200,000 in China, and many of them are in fear of being sent back. And so there are, I would wish that there would be greater hospitality rather than hunting them down and sending them back, which sadly happens in China. And so I would very much be in favor of an expansion, not only by the US, but other countries as well, in terms of what is done for North Korean refugees.
Professor Tan, thank you. The next question comes from David Hawk. The International Bar Association has engaged senior high-level jurists and organized a mock tribunal/hearing in Seoul. Actually, HRNK and the IBA are in the process of preparing a new one dealing with shorter-term detention facilities. So David's question is, how would the outcome of the proposed in absentia hybrid tribunal be different from what is done and what has been done by the International Bar Association, for example, by having a mock tribunal, a mock trial in Seoul?
Yeah, I'm very glad that you did what you did before along these lines, and that there's a future one planned too. I'm very pleased to hear that. The fundamental difference is that basically these would be a hybrid tribunal or domestic prosecution in South Korea. These would be legally binding. There would be nothing mock about them. That these would be ones that could result in arrest warrants. This could result in indictments. That there would be nothing simulated or mock or just public diplomacy. It wouldn't just be for public diplomacy or for communication to the world and so forth, which are all valuable ends as well. But these would be legally binding. A hybrid tribunal or domestic prosecution within South Korea, these would be legally binding proceedings that can have all the array of things that could be done to actually enforce these legal proceedings, which is not there in the mock ones.
Thank you, Ambassador Tan. A question from Mel. You have proposed that accountability be included in talks with North Korea. How would that play into attempts to resolve the nuclear issue? Is it possible to do both?
I do think it is possible to do both. That if one puts the accountability on the table, it gives great motivation to resolve both issues, and potentially great leverage that could be brought to bear in the negotiation process to say, do you want to resolve these? And we can go the path of accountability and justice, which they greatly fear, or you could resolve these security and human rights matters by closing the concentration camps, by giving rights to your people, by dismantling your nuclear program, by eliminating your biological and chemical weapons. There could be smaller steps on the way to some of these larger steps that could be there, but this could give great motivation. Do you want to be prosecuted? Do you want to have justice be brought to bear in these ways, or do you want to resolve this in some other ways? And this could be very much a part of the negotiation process. One of the things that's very sad is that all those who have negotiated on behalf of North Korea get murdered by the Kim regime when they return back to North Korea. And I am under no illusion that negotiations with North Korea are easy or simple or don't need a lot of care and nuance, and the timing, the sequencing, the how one does it, where one does it, all these things matter. And all these things have to be very carefully thought out and approached. But it is something that that should not be shied away from, and it could actually be helpful in resolving these things. But it has to be done very wisely, but no less forthrightly or no less boldly, in order to help to resolve the dual crises of North Korea.
Ambassador Tan, thank you. A question from Orson Mazel. North Korea denies the existence of political prison camps. North Korea does not allow international inspectors to monitor these detention facilities. Is refusal to allow international inspectors into these facilities, is this itself a crime? And then the second part of Orson's question is, do you envision that accountability could be used as leverage for disarmament or for liberation of North Korea or for reunification of the two Koreas? Thank you.
So the latter question first is yes, and I think my prior answer to the prior question pretty much was responding to that. With respect to your first question, I'm not aware of it being a crime per se to prevent human rights inspectors to come. If they had nothing to hide, then they should allow visits to these farming villages. But they have a lot to hide, and so they try to hide it. And so a lot of times when people come to North Korea, they get a very carefully orchestrated propaganda tour. They're not allowed to talk to the people, and I've read so much about these propaganda tours. I could probably give one of their propaganda tours if I were ever called upon. Not that I would ever intend to do so, but what normally comes out from North Korea, sadly, is propaganda, are lies. That is the norm. They rarely tell the truth about things, and when they do, they have a particular purpose for doing so. The norm is mendacity. The norm is telling these propagandistic lies, and so sadly, that is the case. And they have these fake churches run by the Communist Party members inside of these churches, one Catholic, one Protestant, and they say, "See, we have religious liberty," but anyone who has seen these realizes these are not bona fide worship services. These are charades run by the Communist Party members inside of North Korea. And in a lot of ways, North Korea is an ordinary communist country. When I say ordinary communist country, the norm of communist countries in everywhere that communism has been tried, and to use the communist own language, you have a new communist bourgeoisie that seizes everything and crushes the proletariat, the people that is out there. That has happened 100% of the time, every time communism has been tried. So in that sense, North Korea is an ordinary communist regime, sadly, with the banality of evil, to borrow Arendt's phrase. This sort of injustice has become horribly common, to the point of being banal inside of North Korea and banal amongst communist regimes. And so it is very sad, but none of the rest of us should become inured to this. We should never cease to be shocked. We should never cease to care. We should never cease to work to end the mass atrocities and the gross injustices that are going on inside of North Korea.
Pastor Tan, thank you. We're almost out of time. I'm going to bundle the final three questions together. One comes from David Hawk. Following up on the previous question, wouldn't legally binding require the tribunal to be constituted by the Security Council and the government of the Republic of Korea? John Cha asks, what would the hybrid tribunal look like? And finally, Professor Sandra Fahey, how can we ensure that gender-based violence in North Korea is properly addressed?
So in terms of a hybrid tribunal, it typically happens through a treaty. And so it could be the Security Council, it could be the UN Security Council, or some other UN entity. It could be that. It could also be national governments that can also be involved in one way, shape, or form. But typically it's a binding treaty that forms a hybrid tribunal. And so, yes, the UN can and has been in the past been involved in such entities, but they are not the only ones who have gotten involved in such things. There are a lot of specifics that go into a hybrid tribunal. Which law should be used? What should be in the constitutive treaty of that hybrid tribunal? Where should the hybrid tribunal be located? What sort of procedures and evidentiary standards should be set up in regards to this particular hybrid tribunal? These are all very, very important questions. And there is a certain flexibility in the negotiation and formation process in which each of these questions should be very carefully crafted and answered in a way that would be most effective and wisest, and be able to move forward in a way that would bring about justice as much as possible. And so there are a lot of specifics to that. I'm just giving some major categories and examples of things that need to be fleshed out. Again, I don't have time to go into a lot of really minute details in terms of all that, but those are some of the major things that need to be resolved. In terms of gender-based violence, it is sadly all too common in North Korea and needs to be addressed. Women are, in particular, are, it's strange. On the one hand, are targeted for gender-based violence, but in some ways are freer than the men in certain respects. And so that's why women are usually the ones running the markets that exist in North Korea, for example. Most of the refugees are women. We're talking, I think, over 90%, if I understand correctly, if my numbers are still good from when I researched them before. And most of the refugees who are mostly women are suffer in the hands of human traffickers. And so this is a very important dimension of what is going on in the entire North Korea phenomenon. There are forced abortions against women who want to keep their offspring as well. And so there are multiple dimensions to this rape. There's various ways in which this sort of violence and these sorts of crimes take place. And so it's an important angle in the mix and should be addressed as well.
Ambassador Tan, before I thank you, let me remind our participants that our next program will be on Thursday next week, the 18th of March, 4 p.m. Eastern. Professor Bruce Bechtold of Angelo State University will be joining me to discuss North Korea and the Middle East, the security and human rights nexus. That said, let me thank Rosa Park, HRNK Director of Programs, for her good and hard work on this program. Let me thank all of my HRNK colleagues for their good and hard work. Let me thank the participants for joining us today. And Ambassador Morse Tan, you have been extraordinarily generous with your time. You have shared with us your vision. It has been an extraordinarily steep learning curve based on your recommendations, on your vision. We, civil society organizations such as HRNK, have a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you, sir, for sharing your vision, and please do come back to HRNK for both virtual and hopefully in-person programs at some point very soon. Thank you so much.
Honored to do so. Thank you very much, and I look forward to future opportunities.
Thank you.